We're beginning our sermon series called Family Feud, and we're going to be taking a look at Jacob and Esau, two brothers who, if you've grown up in any kind of family you know, don't always get along. The title of this sermon is called Giving Up on God. So if you have a Bible, you can grab it, and we're going to be in Genesis chapter 25 in just a few minutes. But we're going to see how one of the brothers gave a certain and good future away for practically nothing. We see people do that sometimes, and we wonder, why in the world would you make that choice? I don't know if you've heard of athletes sometimes who, maybe there's a young athlete or an established one even, who has a promising career, so much ahead of them, great contract, and then they have this moment of stupidity, or they make a really bad choice, and it ruins their career. You look at that and you wonder, why would you trade all of this career for this one moment of temporary pleasure? Sometimes we look at young married couples, we think, now here's a great couple, the fairy tale wedding, they love each other, they're deeply in love, they have nothing but a bright future ahead of them. And then a little while later, one of them makes a choice for short-term satisfaction that causes their marriage to crash and burn. And when we do that, we say, why in the world would you trade a long future for such a short-term sense, the temporary satisfaction? That's what we're going to look at today. Why would a person trade a promise for a temporary pleasure? It'd be like if you decide you're going to cook steaks, you bring your steak out, you put it on the grill, and the smell of this fresh steak goes over to your neighbor's yard, and he comes over and says, hey, I have a cookie for you. You can eat this cookie right now if you'll trade me and give me that steak when it's done. And we say yes. Like any person in their right mind would, like, why in the world would you trade a steak for a cookie? Like, give yourself another 10 minutes, cook this steak, and you'll be glad you did. Well, today we're going to see that Esau did that same thing. He traded a long-term promise from God in exchange for a very temporary satisfaction. We'll see why he did that. So if you have your Bibles, open up to Genesis chapter 25, and we're going to read verses 29 through 34. So just to let you know again, Jacob and Esau are brothers and don't always get along. Here's what happens. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished. That's why he was also called Edom. Jacob replied, first, sell me your birthright. Look, I'm about to die, Esau said. What good is the birthright to me? But Jacob said, swear to me first. So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank, and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. Like what we see from, if you read just a few verses before that, the Bible tells us that Esau was a skilled hunter. He wasn't some slacker who just decided to go hunt. He was a skilled hunter. He knew what he was doing. We also see that Jacob stayed close to home. But Esau was proficient at what he was doing, but he was going through a period of failure in life. And this period of failure led him to believe that he was going to continue to fail, and that's just the way it was going to be. He normally excelled, but now that he was failing, he thought maybe it was all over for him. And there's no doubt that this period of failure led him to be discouraged. And we think that, like, when we are dealing with failure and discouragement, a lot of times that can magnify other feelings that we have. So if we're succeeding and we're hungry, let's say you're at work and you're hungry, but you're almost done with the job and you've done well, you'll probably say, hey, let's just keep working, get the job done, then we'll go home and enjoy our supper. Or if you're on a trip long trip and you're almost home, rather than stop and get food, you say, we're almost there. Let's just keep going and we'll eat when we get home. But when you're discouraged, it tends to magnify the negative or the troubling feelings. Like when you're discouraged and you're hungry, probably what Esau was saying was, I've been failing, I'm hungry, I'm probably going to continue to fail, and my hunger's only going to get worse. There's no hope. Sometimes we feel like that we failed because we've gone through a period of, or a rough patch. You might feel like a failure because our kids don't feel connected to us the way we want them to be connected, and we feel like, well, I'm just a failure as a parent. We may feel like a failure as a skilled worker because we've been trying hard to improve. We've been working hard to maybe make an advancement, but it seems like no matter how hard we work or how much time we put in, we just don't get acknowledged or recognized for that. Like, what good's it going to do if I keep trying? I'm probably just not going to get anywhere. We may feel like a failure as a spouse because what started off as a great marriage, we love each other, roses and butterflies. That fairy tale marriage is turned into a relationship desert. Sometimes we feel like a failure as a follower of Jesus because it seems like it's been such an incredibly long time since God's used us to do anything significant in someone's life. So we go through these periods of not being fed, and then we get tired and discouraged, and it's tempting to think, well, this is the way life's always going to be. In verse 31, we see that Esau and Jacob negotiated during this time. Esau was discouraged and tired and hungry, and his brother Jacob took advantage of him, tried to. Jacob was not a good brother, and if we're going to work through this story over the next few weeks, but you'll see Jacob was not a good brother. He took advantage of his brother. Esau was being tested. And a lot of times God will allow us to be tested to see how committed we are to his plan. Esau's shifted his focus is what happened. He had a long-term commitment from his father, his birthright, the blessing of the father to receive everything that the father has. But he shifted his focus from a long-term plan to his short-term satisfaction. That's what Jacob did here. He didn't actually force his brother to do anything. It was a decision Esau made. Jacob had no power to take Esau's birthright from him. All he could do was propose an exchange. I know you have this thing that's valuable, but you want this thing that's temporary. I'll trade you. It's like if you've watched the old movie, The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy has these ruby red slippers on. They're special, magical. In the book, they're silver, but they made them red for the movie so they'd stand out more. So Dorothy has on these ruby red slippers that are magical, and the Wicked Witch wants them, but she can't take them from Dorothy. The only thing she can do is offer an exchange to Dorothy. Same thing's true here for Jacob and Esau. Jacob could not take the birthright. Esau had to give it. There are people in our lives that will challenge us or give us opportunities to make exchange like that. I know there's something valuable in your life, but here's something you might like. The question is, are we willing to negotiate our principles and exchange God's long-term plan for some short-term temporary satisfaction? And when we become tired, we deal with difficulties and struggles, it actually becomes easier. It's more tempting to give up on God. Like we loosen our grip on God's promises because we're tired, and we can convince ourselves that the way things are right now is probably just the way they're always going to be, and God's done with us, so I might as well give up. Here's an example from everyday life. Let's say you have gone through a difficult financial time, and then your car starts making some crazy noise, and you think, oh, my car's going to die. You might not have good credit, So what do? You might be tempted to go to a buy here, pay here lot. Now, you know in the long term, you're going to pay at least twice as much as that vehicle is actually worth. And the interest rate is ridiculous. But you feel desperate. So you trade a long-term standard for a short-term remedy, what you think is a short-term remedy. Sometimes we feel that same way with our children. Things start happening and we feel desperate. Like you might feel like, well, I'm about to lose my kids. If you've ever had a teenager, you've gone through teenage years, I'm about to lose them. And we might be tempted to compromise our standards so that we can keep peace with our teens, or maybe they'll like me if I let them do this. Like we compromise our standards. Like, well, sure, you can go spend the night with your boyfriend if that's what you really want to do. Or I know you're going to be out late Saturday night, so why don't you just go ahead and sleep in on Sunday and skip church? Like we have standards, but we compromise them because we see that there might be some short-term satisfaction in it. And with our family, it's easier to give in because we don't want to deal with the tension, the temporary tension. So we give in to things that are sinful rather than standing for God's principle. It's easier to condone someone's sin than it is to lovingly say, I'm not going to allow that, or I'm not going to condone that. Like that causes tension short term. So we trade temporary satisfaction in our relationships for God's long-term standards. Sometimes we feel desperate at work, so we do things out of desperation. Instead of holding to God's standards, we may begin to undermine some of our co-workers to make them look bad so that we can be better, or we can look better. We might take more of the Sunday shift because, well, we think we need the money more than we need to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Or we might adjust some projects so that we can come out ahead. When we feel desperate, we can be tempted to negotiate God's long-term standards for short-term or temporary satisfaction. Verse 32 tells us that Esau was physically exhausted because he was having a rough time. And that's normal. When we go through difficult times, sometimes we're just physically exhausted. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's interesting to note that Esau wasn't far from home, because the Bible tells us just before where we read that Jacob didn't go far from home. And if Esau had returned and he was getting food from Jacob, where was he? He was close to home. But he was so discouraged and hungry that he even lost sight of where he was, and he chose to make the deal. He assumed he would die, so he gave up his birthright. And what he did there is he placed more significance on his assumed future than he did his guaranteed birthright. Verse 34 said that Esau despised his birthright. That's the English translation. If you stretch it out a little bit, in Hebrew, what it actually means is he had little regard for his birthright. He didn't value it as much anymore. There was a long-term standing with his family that he traded for a meal. Esau allowed his feelings, his present feelings, to affect facts. He used his feelings to change the facts. He exchanged an uncertain future for a meal and actually created a certain future, a future without his birthright. What he said was, I don't know what the future holds. It's probably going to be this. So I'll just go ahead and give up on God's standard anyway. And when you give up on God's standard, you solidify the future. I could talk a lot about that. When you give up on God's standard because of an uncertain future, you solidify the future. Here's a question I'd like us to consider over the next week. If we take a realistic look at our lives, can we see places where we hold God's plan in low regard. We may have times or places in our lives where we have just struggled and it's been really difficult, and we think it would be easier if we just take the easy route right now. So looking at our private lives or our relationships or work or even our commitment to the family that God has given us in our local church, are there places where we have compromised God's long-term plan and exchanged it for some temporary satisfaction? Now, this may seem a bit depressing, but the good news is that in life, if you want to mature, the first thing you need to do is identify the problem. And that's what we've been working this week on, is where's the problem? Where's my moment of compromise? Or where am I giving up on God's standard? We can take that and then move to the next step that we're going to deal with next week. So I'm looking forward to seeing you again. But this week, spend a little bit of time of analyzing your own life. Are there places where I am compromising God's long-term plan and I'm trading it for some short-term or temporary satisfaction? Hope you have a good week, and I look forward to seeing you soon.